haven't started recording. Sorry, so I'm just going to go back. Okay. Yeah. So realise that 31% say they believe the white people suffer most from the harmful consequences of climate change, and a similar proportion believe all ethnic groups are equally as vulnerable. And one of the main reasons for why people think this is partly because of what they see in the media. A lot of media coverage is about the impact of our actions on the environment, and there's not enough coverage about the people that are mostly affected. And of course, both are important, but it's quite interesting, what is currently visible in the media at the moment and which voices are validated that actually shapes the way that people see this issue and also consider those who are most affected. And so we ran another poll to find out Black Christian views on climate change. And we actually, spoke with Black Christians in Anglican churches, those in Black majority churches, as much as those in the wider community. And that also came back with some surprising results. So 66% of Black Christians feel they know at least a fair amount about climate change, compared to half, which is 49% of the British public. And actually, being born in a climate vulnerable country increases awareness of the climate crisis. And it was quite interesting to find out that many have deep connections to their home countries, and speak to relatives bearing the brunt of this issue, but are underrepresented within the wider climate movement. And also 50% didn't think that the environmental justice movement is racially diverse enough and wanted their church to stand up for justice. So Christian Aid, we brought together some of the most influential Black faith leaders, Christians, activists of colour, to really try to understand and look at this data, but also to really increase the visibility of their voices within the wider climate justice movement. And this really helped us to work together to be able to co-create resources that will increase awareness among Black Christians and inspire positive action. And one of the most interesting things that really came out of this, and is still coming out of this work we're currently doing, is the real need to increase greater links between Church of England, Black majority churches, activists of colour, and also MPs to campaign for positive change. Because, this is mainly based on recognition that climate change affects all of us. And like COVID, the harsh reality is that it is affecting Black and brown people around the world in unequal ways. As people of colour, we live in the most deprived areas in the UK and the global south. Our families are confined to overcrowded living conditions where self-isolation is not an option. And those on low incomes have no choice but to work on the front lines, and often in unsafe conditions, risking their lives to feed their families for less than the living wage. And of course, in our cities, Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities are often worst affected by air pollution, with high reports of asthma and other health conditions. And when we look at the global south, be it rural families in Bangladesh, pastoralists in northern Kenya, we also see that they're struggling with all of what I've mentioned, but also, they are on the front lines of frequent floods, drought, and also food shortages. And, this is quite alarming in many ways, and actually helps us to think about the fact that, since this is a global crisis that affects all of us, we need all our brothers and sisters in Christ at the table, including Black and brown activists in the UK and the global south, to improve systems that keep people poor. Because as said before, many speak to their relatives bearing the brunt of this issue, and yet are not represented within the movement. And for many, this is more than statistics, because these numbers turn into names, and these names turn into people that we know. And so, just to And really, quite often some of the excuses that we've heard from the movement of why it isn't racially diverse enough is often that, you know, people of colour are hard to engage. And what's really coming out of this work, and you hear from speakers today, is that the climate justice movement, you know, in many ways, people of colour are not hard to engage, but it's actually the climate justice movement which is hard to access. And, you know, finally, just to say that, you know, what came out also from the poll was that language was one of the biggest barriers. You know, language around climate change is too scientific and alienates people of colour. I mean, what does net zero mean to a farmer in Kenya who hasn't seen rain for 2 years? I mean, his environment, especially land, has dried up and can't produce any crops to feed his family. You know, what does net zero mean to his pregnant wife who can't get the right nutrients to be able to, you know, birth a healthy baby? And what does that mean for their child who has to go to school breathing in fumes and, you know, on an empty stomach and having to miss class because of poor health conditions? You know, these farmers' stories are missing in conversations seeking to tackle what we need to admit is a global crisis, and therefore needs diverse voices and views at the table. So I would like us to just pause there for a minute, just to reflect on what we've heard, and then I'll invite Carol to share her perspectives on this issue. Okay, so Carol.
Hi.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Carol Nganga. I am a community development practitioner, founder Msingi Trust, where we make the connections between faith, social justice, activism, and advocacy. And I'm really glad to be here. Asante Sarah for welcoming me into this space to share my story. So as I've been part of, the pilot engagement tool? I've been part of analyzing that tool, and I've really enjoyed being in community with Black activists and church leaders on how climate change intersects with theology and Black lived realities. And when Sarah invited me to share my story on this perspective, I thought that the easiest way to explain or to bring us closer to this conversation is through speaking about story. And I want us to talk about a return to story. So as I said, I'm Carol, and I am from the Kikuyu community. And we have an original story. We have a belief system of origin, but I'll just talk about 3. We believe that our forefather, called Kikuyu, came from our holy mountain and met with Mombi. Mombi means creator, our foremother, at the base of Kirinyaga. Kirinyaga is Mount Kenya. Then we also strongly believe in the sacred nature of animals and trees and the ecosystem. And as I said, I'll talk about 3, and that the second belief is that we believe that trees are sacred, and the most sacred of them are the Mokoyo, our tree of origin, and the Mugumo tree. This tree, these trees are altars, and many prayers to Mwene Nyaga are made here. In our story of who we are in our culture is that we prayed here. And then Kirinyaga, Mount Kenya, the meaning of Mount Kenya is that Kirinyaga, which was renamed Kirinyaga because the colonialists at that time could not say Kirinyaga, so they said Kenya. So the meaning is that that mountain is full of brightness because of the snow-peaked mountains, and prayers are made facing these mountains until there. So for us, Mount Kenya, Mount Kirinyaga is God's dwelling place. Then our third belief is that that the original location of the Gikuyu Eden is in Central Province near that Gaturi village of Murang'a district at a place called Mukurwe Wanyagathaga. It is believed to be by the Gikuyu to be the cradle of the tribe. The Mukurwe is a common tree in Kikuyu land, and once it's for general use tree in Gikuyu land. And so I hope that by now you're seeing that nature, tree are very important to our story. They are very important to the story of worship, the story of identity, and to the story of daily utility. So if we look at our traditional stories and the Genesis story, I want to connect traditional stories, the Genesis stories, and climate change. So from most indigenous communities, they have traditional stories of origin. Nature is involved and is core to the origin and the well-being of the birth of the community. Most of the cultures in the world have a connection to the garden and therefore a responsibility to tend nature and protect the garden, because the garden was not removed from their identity and purpose. Colonization, Christianity, and modernization happened, and many communities were distant from their stories of origin. The Genesis story of creation happens in a garden where there is lushness, identity formation, communion with God, and belonging that happens there. Sin and disobedience happens, and then there's the process of being cut off from the garden. So our continued disconnection to the garden story, to its importance, to its connectivity, to our communal identity is core to climate change. And Sarah, you were saying before that the language of climate change is very scientific now, but imagine how beautiful and simple it was when it was connected to the story of our community, to the story of who we are, to our identities. It was a day-to-day lived reality. There's no net zero, there's no carbon, all those, the carbon tax, all of those, even though it's important to have that as for scientific resources and research, we need to ask ourselves what stories were created so that people understood the importance of trees, the importance of rivers, the importance of mountains, and what how people related to each other in that ecosystem. So these stories, what they did is that the stories we have of sacred trees, rivers, and mountains give us a mandate to care for them. Many of the harmful behaviors that cause climate change have come about because we've deviated from the stories of who we are. So because we are not connected to the tree as part of our ecosystem, we can chop down all trees. Because we are not connected to the river as part of our identity and who we are, and making the river a part of the community, then we can pollute the river. And also the other major things that we have that have removed us from that is the distorted identities through racism, patriarchy, conquest, capitalism, and imperialism. We seek to outproduce, outdominate, outconquer, and outsubjugate. The creation of inequality and competition is at the cost of the ecosystem and humanity. We have to ask ourselves, what is the counter story to the extractive, destructive story of disconnection from the earth? And so how do I propose that we do this? We need to actively join in the many in the denouncing of narratives and systems that come to earth to do the devil's work of stealing, killing, and destroying nature. This is through recognizing the importance of indigenous stories of creation that serve as an identity of our people, but also a protector of nature. It is through admitting our role in the destruction, through our acts of commission or omission, what we have done or what we have failed to do. And then also it is returning to your stories of origin and connection to land, forest, and wildlife. I know from a lot of British folklore, there's the connection to land, there's a connection to trees, there's a connection to the field. And I'm saying that because all our cultures have a connection to land and her resources, and in a way that it's not master and it's not master slave story, but it is a connection that coexists, because we know that the land is there for us and we're there for the land. And so, yeah, we've said we need to actively join the many in the denouncing of narratives and systems that kill and destroy, and returning to your own stories of origin. So I want to ask us on this call, what is your story of origin? What is your story of connection to land? What is your story of connection to the animals? What's the story of connection to the birds? And how do you connect that to the larger story of this? Because sometimes when you look at this big letters of extraction of the people who are doing big businesses and big industrialization, we might think that it's too hard, it's too far away, but I'm asking us to come closer home to your story of origin and find out what is your story. And so why Msingi exists, I said I founded Msingi. Msingi exists to make the connections between faith, justice, and advocacy. And we do this through connection of struggles, stories, and denouncing narratives that disconnect us from each other through injustices past and present. We do this through hosting conversations, creating and disseminating content, and making connections, especially between faith leaders and grassroots human rights defenders. So there is our information in case you'd like to know more about us, and follow us on Facebook. Our website is, our new website is under construction. But I hope that from this conversation, what comes out is that because we are disconnected from the story of who we are as a people, then we can dare disconnect nature from our story. But nature is our story. We are part of nature, and we need nature to survive, rather than what we mostly think that nature needs us. We need nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I think what came out quite strongly there is that, you know, the importance of frame of reference, you know, because of course, in many ways, your frame of reference, as you are, you know, living in Kenya, and you're actually, you know, kind of living in and seeing climate devastations all around you, but it's really coming from that human level. and coming from that connection with story, really encouraging all of us to do that beyond just the statistics and the science that we hear a lot of in the media and can either alienate people and really deter many from getting involved. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm pretty sure there'll be some questions that we can explore later on. So I'm going to ask everyone just to kind of pause for another minute, just based on what Carol has shared, before we move on to our next speaker. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to invite Melanie Nazareth, who is of Indian heritage, and she's also a climate activist who's part of Christian Climate Action.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Do you want to leave the screen share up, or is it easier?
Happy to do that, unless you want me to.
It might be better if you just took it down, then I can see who I'm talking to, at least some of you.
Brilliant. So, okay. There you go.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. This is such an important thing that we're talking about today. So why do I do this work? I'm going to start with a controversial but shocking statistic, although we've been talking about not having statistics in science, but that statistic is that 400,000 people are estimated to be killed by the effects related to climate and environmental effects each year, with 360,000 infants killed by the increased spread of disease in our hotter world. I know that's a controversial statistic, but the estimate is from UN-commissioned research by DARA International in 2012. And each of those persons, each of those people is beloved by God. And I think that's what we've got to remember, not the number. And here's another statistic. Climate-fueled disasters were the #1 driver of internal displacement over the last decade. They forced an estimated 20 million people a year from their homes. And that's from a piece of Oxfam research in 2019. And the research also shows that overall, the effects of global climate change are predicted to be heavily concentrated in poorer populations at lower latitudes, where the most important climate-sensitive health outcomes like malnutrition and diarrhea and malaria are already common, and where the vulnerability to climate change is greatest and the diseases mainly affect younger age groups, so that the total burden of disease due to climate change appears to be borne mainly by children in developing countries. Countries that we now call the global south, perhaps the majority world. And my ethnicity and my family story tie me to these places, but even if it didn't, those people most affected are my brothers and sisters, my neighbors. And it seems to me that against the background of the failure of rich countries and corporations to adequately mitigate and protect against human-caused climate breakdown, what's happening can be described as racist, because the protagonists are mainly white and the victims are mainly black and brown. And for me, it's a matter of justice and righteousness and equity, that those who benefit from inequality endeavor to address that inequality. And so I asked myself, and I ask you too, actually, because you're here, what can we do? We are Christ's hands and feet on this earth. the Christ Jesus who turned over the tables of the moneylenders and drove out their animals because his father's house was being desecrated. And we need to take action. And the prophets of the Old Testament spoke truth to power. Where is my prophetic voice? Where is our prophetic voice? Where are we speaking up for those on the front line of climate change who are dying today? And how can we be allies of those who are at the sharp end of climate change? So amongst other things, I take action on the streets with a group of Christians called Christian Climate Action, who work with Extinction Rebellion, although the group predates Extinction Rebellion. And within that, I work to centre climate and racial justice. And maybe that's the sort of direct activism that you feel called to do. Maybe that's something that you want to go away and think about, because I'd say that there's a strong narrative of civil resistance and direct action in the Bible. But I have to acknowledge that that's not a route for everyone, and particularly for people of colour, that's a difficult route. But even if you are not called to do that, each of us has the opportunity to be a prophetic voice. At its most basic, each of us can ask the Spirit to give us the courage to have those conversations that I've spoken about, conversations about the root of the climate crisis being actually rooted in slavery, because that was the money that funded the Industrial Revolution. And that continued extractive, exploitative thread is what fuels our way of life that causes the climate crisis. So maybe we should have the courage to have those conversations with our friends, our family, our work colleagues, and on our social media. So I think, Sarah Jane, do I have a couple of minutes just to say a little bit about myself, because it ties in with what I consider to be God's call to me.
Of course, yeah.
So I describe myself as a reluctant activist. Until about 2 years ago, I was probably about as far from being an activist as you can imagine. I'm actually a lawyer. I'm a mother. I'm a Sunday school teacher. And I'd been on marches, but that was about it. And I vividly remember the day because it was my 58th birthday and it changed my life. We just come back from a holiday on which I'd been by plane. And as I walked back from work over Waterloo Bridge in London, I saw this large protest, and I knew little about the most catastrophic and urgent consequences of climate change. I kind of knew vaguely about what was going on, but nothing about how it underlay every social justice problem we seek to address. But I just went over to see why the police were arresting people. And as I stood there and watched, I felt this deep sense of needing not to be a bystander, but to be with the people on the other side of the line of police. And after a short while, I actually followed that call. And ever since, I've been part of the Extinction Rebellion movement, taking direct action to bring attention to the climate crisis and to engage people of power in taking meaningful action to address climate change. I don't put myself in the way of being arrested. But I just bear public Christian witness to the harm. And in a way, I guess it's my way of repenting. But it's also been fulfilling and joyful. And I'm really deeply grateful that at the age of almost 60, God has given me this opportunity. And so my final thought on this is to ask ourselves, where is our opportunity to be allies, to centre climate justice in this discussion? So thank you. Thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was a very thought-provoking kind of words around this and how you got started, and really getting us thinking about the power of our prophetic voice and how do we use that to be able to, you know, raise awareness and inspire people to take action, but also, you know, not needing to be a bystander, and where the opportunity arrives for us to really have that courage to take the steps forward. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm pretty sure there'll be some more questions later on. So I'm going to hand over to Radhika Bainan. Radhika is of Bangladeshi heritage. She is a climate activist and part of Green Christians, and also the current work that we're doing and she's going to talk a little bit about the power of lived experience. So I'll hand over to Radhika.
Hello, thank you very much. Hi, Sarah Jane, and thank you to everybody. It's really good to be here. I'm actually of Sri Lankan heritage, but hey, let's, you know, no, that's really not a thing. Melanie, it's always so good to hear your story and your the way you really, you know, your story of how you got you stepped in to this place of action is it always prompts me to think, you know, what's my role in this, Lord? Where do I need to be? And I guess that's where I come in at this. I too, you know, I'm a Christian. I am interested in lots of things. I've worked, I've campaigned and you know, done things around everything from anti-apartheid to, you know, to refugees to whatever, but not in a kind of in the way of just joining marches and writing letters and feeling that part of my role as a Christian is that the Lord calls me to play an active role. So I have sought to do that. But actually, like Melanie, for me, the realization of climate change, I mean, I think we're all on this call because we all feel like this is a big thing. This is something that we as a generation have a responsibility to do something. And you know, and again, I'm in the where, Lord, am I in this? What, Lord, should I be doing? And so I've been delighted to be part of this group of that Sarah Jane has called together, a group of Christians of colour who have an interest in this, who have leadership roles in their own congregations, in their own movements. And I'm not a leader. I'm a member of a congregation, and I do Sunday school and I do all the things. But I am a Christian who wants to make a difference in the world. And so I've sort of somehow snuck into this group. I don't know how Sarah Jane let me in, but I've got into this group of Christian leaders. And the thing that I have brought to that is in my work, I work in research and I work in social change, and so in my work I have found a bit like Carol the importance of story. And so I'm really aware that climate change is something that many people care about, and that it is not a small, minor, marginal thing, that many of our friends, our networks, you know, many people are very concerned about it and basically try and shut it off because they don't know what to do. It's like terrifying, and it's like I don't know where to begin. It's too big. I can't, you know. And I know that's the case as a person of colour, as a person who has been part of Black majority churches in the past. You know, I know that is the same for all my friends too. And yet somehow the climate movement and the way climate justice, the way climate is discussed and explored in our culture doesn't seem to have space for them. It seems to be, why are there not more people of colour, Black people, you know, present in the climate movement? And that's something that's bothered me, because I want to be part of this movement. I want to feel I can belong, and I want everybody else to be there. As Sarah Jane says, we all need to be part of this. We're not going to be able to change the direction of global capitalism if just a few people do it. Like, you know, it's a big tanker to turn around. It needs us all. And so in that, I started, as part of the work that Sarah Jane's doing, I started to look at what are the stories that that people of colour have. How do Black people of colour, how do we engage with climate, and is it the same? And one of the things that really emerged from that work was the point that Sarah Jane made at the beginning, that actually talk of ecology and animals, and it doesn't necessarily connect in the same way. For many people, equality and social justice is a major driver. For me, as somebody who has worked and fought for and been conscious of inequality my whole life in this country, you know, I am really, you know, it's an important framing for me. And I think if you are conscious of experiencing inequality, to see climate change framed in that way is much more engaging than it is to think about it in terms of polar bear. No, I don't want to be dismissive about other people's climate concerns, because it all matters. It all matters. But certainly an approach to climate that starts with justice connects much more. And so the work that I've been doing has been to work with Sarah Jane and Christian Aid to talk to some to talk to people of colour who are interested in climate and say, how did you come to this? Sarah Jane, am I able to share my screen?
Of course you can. Just bear with me for a second.
And then I will show you. So what we have done is basically I talked to a group of people who have, including Melanie, and said, and so this is Melanie, Sarah, but let me just show you. So basically what this is available on the Christian Aid website, I do believe, and this is the resource. And basically it's a set of stories that says that acknowledges how and features how people of colour, so Rosemary Mallett, how this, a significant person in the Anglican Church, why are you interested in climate? So a little bit about, like the way that Carol said, this is how Rosemary entered climate. And we have a series of stories, and what is true about these stories, Gideon from Ghana and Israel, also an African Christian. And what's interesting about these stories is that there's a real strong theme of social justice in this, that people of colour come to this story saying, I am, the way that Melanie spoke, I am moved by the plight of people, and I want to take action on this because I care about people. And I feel like we need, as people who are concerned about climate, we need to say, I'm going to stop sharing it. We need to start from that and say to people and frame this story around human life. And I think that brings a much wider group in. And I think that if we're wanting to talk to people, people of colour, Black people, to people who are concerned about justice, this is the lens from which to start. And I'm really keen that the climate movement generally in this country moves from being something about ecology to being something about justice, because that centres it on human experience. And I think that will bring a lot more people in. And I think that we cannot think of climate as something that is just for, as I said before, just for some people to act. It's for us all to act. And I'm really concerned that as we try to talk, as you and I talk to our friends and our fellow church folk about what shall we do, I think to frame it around justice is a more engaging, more inclusive way of talking about it. Certainly, that's what in my community, it is a more inclusive way of talking about it than talking about planet. And the last thing I'm going to say to you is that we are all part of churches, and one of the things that I really want us all to do this year, in the year of COP26, is to talk to our leaderships, whatever form that takes, to say, what can we as a church do to put our voice against this? The church in this country has been so influential in social change over time, and as a young person, I remember Jubilee 2000, and I was so inspired by it. Churches came together and we changed, and we brought down debt, guys. It was an amazing achievement. And we can, and this is a year when we all need to put our shoulder to the wheel. So I'm going to say to you, what can you do in your church? And there's an organization called Hope for the Future who are trying to get churches to talk to their MPs. The Anglican Church is doing, lots of people are doing things. So that's my last thing. What can each of us do?
Thank you so much, Ritika. Lots of food for thought in terms of, us starting from justice as a way to connect all of us to this issue, because in many ways the reason why we're all here and we've done so much work, and I imagine those who are here with us today have done as well, is that we care about this issue, and we care about, the common good for all of humanity. And so justice is a lovely way for us to really connect and join up with each other to take action together. And one of the questions you ask is also, how can we share this within our church networks and leaders in those networks to be able to really affect change? So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just going to ask for us to go straight into the questions discussions because of time. And so I'm going to open up the floor for anyone to ask our panelists questions. Please feel free to use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take it from there. Anyone wants to start? Okay, so we've got one. So okay, so we've got a question from Tolu. So Tolu, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you very much for this. I'm fairly new to this whole conversation, and it's amazing that there's a forum like this. I'm also keen to try and start to talk about this more with my friends, and I attend a predominantly Black church, and it's very difficult to raise some of these issues because people find that there's a perception that there are more pressing issues, particularly in some of those communities, such as other injustices that they're facing, poverty, insecurity. Like, I know one of the biggest actions that we are taking collectively is divestment, as an example. Divestment from fossil fuels, which is an excellent thing to do, but that's not something that a lot of communities from that background, they're not even investing in the first instance because they don't have those resources. So how do we engage in a meaningful way with those communities to get them to really see themselves as having a part, not just in the story or I think that's an excellent starting point, but in real change, and how do they actually affect the real change that the rest of us are trying to make? I hope that made sense. Sorry for rambling on a bit.
No, that was a really good question. So I'll just open up to our speakers. So how do people from Black majority churches, including young people and senior citizens, really meaningfully engage in this issue? So Melanie, Ratika, and Carol.
Can I say something? So Tolu, I mean, I think this is the fact that people are facing injustice today, that people facing pressing concerns of poverty and exclusion and racial injustice and all that, that those are things those are real, and I think somehow, but human beings are amazing, capable people who can hold two truths to be true. So definitely there is, I don't think we can say worry about the future and don't worry about today. Let's worry about climate change, but let's not fight for justice today. I think we fight for justice today, absolutely, and we fight for the inequalities that people experience, but climate change is an inequality. So I work in air pollution. Air pollution is, people, that child died, Elekesi Deborah died in Southwark because of air pollution. The coroner said she died because of air pollution. And now, it's a Black child growing up in a community which is in the inner city where air pollution is much higher. So climate change affects us today. But I don't think we need to be alarmist about it. I think what we just need to say is that this is true. There is injustice to be fought today, and this is also true, we have to think about our children and our grandchildren and our friends and relatives across the world. So, you know, like, we have to somehow pedal both bikes.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Melanie, Carol, if you'd like to come in.
Tolu, I would also say that one of the things that we need to do in Black and spaces and spaces where there are a lot of people of colour is begin to talk about exercising our political voice. In a lot of these spaces, people kind of shy away from politics, particularly national politics, because there's so much else on their plate. But actually, it really is important that we begin to engage in that. And one starting point would be I think the National Church Leaders Forum have put out a manifesto which talks about our political responsibilities as citizens. So I think that's another good place to start.
Okay, thank you so much. And for time, I'll move on straight to David Hogan question, and then come to Sharon and John afterwards.
Oh, hi. Yes, I was trying to work out what all these buttons and icons and things do.
That's okay, you got there.
I've done it before. Yeah, I work in soil science, and that's a very neglected area of environmental understanding. And I have a bit of a headache from many years of banging my head against that particular brick wall, and to understand how how best to, and we're still doing it, how best to convey the messages of research and investigations about the importance of soil. Well, two things struck me really. One is, in that regard, I have problems in identifying what you might call a target audience from what I'm trying to say. I've just completed some work for our local national park in Dartmoor, near where I live in Devon, and I wrote the report that went with my survey in a way to avoid as much technical jargon as I could, or at least to explain everything. The first comment I got back was, "Oh, I think that's very interesting," brackets probably, but there's an awful lot of stuff that we didn't understand. So I'm now grappling with, try not to dumb down so that you lose the important messages, but also trying to identify precisely who you're trying to get the message to, and how is the most effective way of doing it. And this seems to kind of, spill over everywhere. And just very briefly, the other thing that I've sort of tried to do, not so much in connection with soil science, but the fact that, we're all part of creation, and we shouldn't really make so much of what you might call artificial boundaries between humankind and all the rest of creation and the living world, which is so well displayed in documentaries and so on. So it's just that our sort of problem almost is that as a species we've developed to the level where we have self-awareness, and so we've sort of frightened ourselves to death with anxiety, whereas other animals just kind of do what they do. So we have to take a certain responsibility in that regard. And as somebody said once, it's funny how you remember the odd things that people say, who's going to speak up for the earthworm? Anyway, I'll just draw a line there. These are just some reflections that I have from my almost professional background, if you like, which obviously overspills into everything else.
Thank you so much, David. That also left some food for thought, I think. And it also kind of raises the idea around, all of us in some ways taking a holistic approach to this, recognizing that we are in kinship with nature and humans, but also bringing on board scientists as much as also people like Carol who are living in it, to be able to see how we can tackle this in a holistic way, because the cause and effect of these issues is a life and death situation for people who are on the front lines of this crisis. And so it's brilliant to hear your thoughts on some of the ways that we can engage more people in this issue. So thank you so much for that. And then I'm going to come on to Sharon and John. So Sharon and John, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. I put it in the chat for people to think about. This idea that was said at the very beginning, that we are very good at being concerned about fluffy animals, about the animals of the savannah, and how do we make a transition between raising awareness of climate change and how it affects our animal kingdom and how it is affecting people, God's people, throughout the world. And we as Christians in the church, how can we facilitate this changeover? Not losing the animals on the way, admittedly, but how can we raise the awareness further?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Carol?
Well, I think, in all honesty, first, there needs to be a repentance of how much animals have meant to some people versus how the same communities have treated people. I know of a story my friends shared. There was a big cold front in Cape Town, and a homeless person died. The uproar was, then there was a dog that was left behind. People were more concerned about the dog that was left behind than the woman who died. We need to ask ourselves why that is, how we've allowed ourselves to get there. And as Black and brown people, I hope that I can be honest here and say, we have seen how animals are treated, especially historically. They've been treated, or they've been actually used in our subjugation. And so when, especially animals like dogs especially, and all of that, they were used as tools of torture and of violence. And so when we see that they are the ones that are, and then also in conservation here in Kenya, when we see animals now are becoming more important than the communities around. And so it really is, we need to flip that script. It's not either or, it's both and. We are in an ecosystem, and sometimes you can't say, okay, let's take care of the rhino, but at the same time, and this is happening right now, especially the white rhino, black rhino, one of those rhinos, they are now being taken care of at the expense of communities. All those ranches and all those big conservancies have fenced themselves off from people. And so, yeah, we just need to be honest and say that people are people as well. People need to be loved as much as animals, and also repent of the complicit way in which animals have been used to further exploitation and subjugation of our people and of our community. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I'm just going to hand over to either Melanie or Ratika to touch on some of the resources that we've created, to really support Christians and churches to raise awareness within the wider community around climate change, and really try and bring people who are coming from, both ends of the spectrum. So for those whose frame of reference is out of a love for ecology and nature and animals, and also for those whose frame of reference is coming from what Carol's talking about, which is more about those who are affected by this issue, as much as just the human lives and stories who are also affected. So Ratika or Melanie, if you'd like to talk a bit more about some of those resources.
I think Ratika might have had to leave.
Okay.
So I think
So
which is a shame, because she actually was much more involved in creating those resources than I. But I think that, Sarah Jane, maybe you could just put the web addresses.
yes, absolutely, yeah.
There's a wonderful new website page.
Yes, absolutely. And just quickly, because I am conscious of time, happy to just share my screen on these resources that we have put together, just so people can have a look at them. So the first we do have is, I'm going to go through this. Yeah, so we do have the Climate Story resource, which Ritika spoke about, in terms of, you know, kind of Black and brown activists, colours perspective on these issues, which is on the Christian Aid website, and I'll include the link in the chat board. We do also have a conversation guide for church groups to help equip members of the congregation to take action. And these are very kind of suitable for Bible studies, sermons around Christian care, and to engage with the communities in the wider, in people in the wider community. As much as also we have church posters, which we've created around some of the theology on climate justice, because we recognise that for many communities, you know, this is still a relatively new area, and may not have been on the same journey as those who are currently active on this issue. And so these kind of church posters give some idea around, you know, what does the Bible say about climate justice, and how can we come together, irrespective of frame of reference, to be able to explore our passions for the common good and helping our environment and people in it. So I'll add the link in the chat board if people want to have a look. And just before we close, are there any more questions that people have before we end? Okay, Arthur, would you like to come in? You're on mute at the moment, Arthur. So if you unmute your mic. There we go, yeah.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I've been more than happy to be a part of this today. Thank you. These are just observations. They're not meant as criticisms in any way. I was intrigued by the terms black and brown. Perhaps that indicates how out of date I am with the terminology. And I wonder how you would define that as opposed to people of colour. And the one comment is, I take great comfort in knowing, and I forget the figures, but the word justice appears, I believe, more often in the Bible than love. So I think if we always bear that in mind, that might help us on our journey with regards to climate justice, justice for all, really. Thank you.
Absolutely, and those are great questions and also reflections on that. In terms of you know, references to black and brown or people of colour, I guess those terms are used interchangeably, but it's really to recognise the communities that are disproportionately affected, and also look at the kind of race and background of those who are mostly affected. And it's to really shine a light on people that are often ignored, often forgotten and siloed because of the kind of issues that are prioritised within the movement. And just to be able to say that all issues around climate change is really important. But in some ways, the issues affecting people and the communities they come from needs to be seen as, you know, just as important as, you know, the current ones that we are looking at, which we've we've spoken about today, including nature and ecology. And so those kinds of terms referring to these communities are used interchangeably. And I wonder if Melanie or Carol want to say anything around that as well.
I think Carol's just left as well, but terminology is a bit of a political minefield and a bit of a social minefield. We use in this country the expression BAME, as in Black and Minority Ethnic, and I really dislike that because it sort of emphasizes the minority aspect. I tend to use BIPOC, Black, Indigenous and people of colour, but actually there's a concept of political blackness, which is the idea of people who are visibly, by the colour of their skin, kind of marginalised in society. But there is a real issue about the colour of people's skin. So there's a separate concept of being Black, which doesn't encompass people like me. I'm at me within the definition of political blackness, but I'm brown. So yeah, you can use them in different contexts. Just so long as people use them respectfully, I don't mind how they use them, but think about how you use them. It is kind of the message.
Absolutely. Thanks, Melanie. And finally, we have Stephen's question before we close.
Whatever we've got left, yes, we'll just put that.
Sorry, did you mean me?
Yes.
I live in Manchester. I used to be a ESOL teacher, minority ethnic pupils, and I've also lived in South Africa. When I lived in South Africa, it was quite clear what the background story of my people I worked with was. In Manchester, I'm often dealing with third generation migrants. I've got 3 grandchildren who have mothers who are people of colour, one born in Cape Town, one born in Nigeria. Their story, their background story, isn't so clear. If I talk to them about it, they're more likely to come up with Peppa Pig and the 3 Little Pigs than they are necessarily with a story about a tree. And I feel there's a plasticity now of cultures, which makes it very difficult to talk to people without this sensitivity and hoping that they will be able to volunteer a story. I'm not sure there's a way forward, particularly, other than to be polite, deferential, and almost to tell my story. So for me, that's going to involve talking about the allotment, talking about my experience living with neighbours who were Black, my experience of working with people who live in Moss Side. But I think we have to be very aware that there are a whole variety of stories. So when I'm talking to the ex-JP, who was almost a Windrush migrant into the UK, who's in my congregation, I'm going to have to be different when I'm talking to the Iranian in my congregation.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Those are really good points. I think that language, in some ways plays a big part in that, in how people connect or disconnect from the issue and how they relate to the stories that are being told, the angle that they're coming from, as much as also the invitation for them to share their own stories. And I also guess that in some ways, the visibility or the limited level of visibility within the media perpetuates people's reluctance to even talk about this. And when I say people, I'm talking about, kind of people from my community, Melanie's community is, just kind of Black and brown people in the UK. If we don't see people that look like us talking about these issues, it's quite difficult for us to connect with it, because as mentioned before, many are thinking about the day-to-day struggles that they're going through within their own lives, let alone worry about the environment, and conversations around the environment, which they're not really exposed to unless they're meeting people like Melanie, they're seeing, speaking with people like yourselves. And so I guess in some ways, how can we deconstruct the language around climate change in a way that really invites people to open up and consider how they connect to this issue and what kind of actions they can take as well. So I hand over to Melanie in case she wants to add to that too.
Now, I think listening is really important. I think being willing to listen to other people's stories. I'm going to say something that's a little bit controversial, particularly in an audience like this, but some of the efforts that we have made in the past have been kind of rooted in a bit of a white savior complex. And I think that's something to be avoided at all costs. I think it's really important to recognize the agency of people of color, Black and brown people, and marginalized communities in this, and to allow them to have their own voice, which involves firstly listening and then maybe handing over the microphone.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Melanie. And so just to close, we hope that, you know, this has really left a lot of food for thought and also inspired many of you in some ways to explore this area and have conversations with you know, Black and brown people in your communities, as well as with each other, about what are the ways that we can join up with those who are active on this issue from diverse backgrounds to be able to affect positive change. And as I've put in the chat, there are some resources that we have created, so please do feel free to check them out to really help start these conversations with a wide range of people. And, you know, we're happy to, you know, support in any way that we can for positive change. So please feel free to share anything that you're doing around this and ways that we can support. But thank you once again so much for staying to the end. And I hope you found this session really useful.